It was an ordinary day on my ranch, a place of solitude, hard work, and the pride of self-sufficiency. As I tended to my morning chores, a sleek black SUV pulled into my driveway, kicking up a cloud of dust against the backdrop of open fields. The HOA leader, Mr. Campbell, stepped out, dressed sharply in a suit that looked out of place amidst the rugged terrain. His arrival was as surprising as it was unwelcome. My ranch was outside the jurisdiction of any HOA. Mr. Campbell's expression was a mixture of smug confidence and determination. He had an air of authority that he seemed to believe granted him power wherever he went. Without hesitation, he approached me, clipboard in hand, and introduced himself with a tone that suggested he was doing me a favor by being there. He started with pleasantries, but his eyes scanned the property like a predator assessing its prey. I could sense his intentions weren't entirely noble. The conversation quickly shifted to the purpose of his visit. He claimed that my ranch fell under the HOA's purview due to a recent expansion of their boundaries. I listened in silence, letting him explain his so-called reasoning. As he spoke, his confidence grew, but so did my suspicion. This was my land, purchased outright, far from suburban developments and the bureaucratic grip of an HOA. The idea that they had jurisdiction here was absurd. When I questioned his claims, he attempted to justify them with vague legal jargon. "It's all in the bylaws," he said, tapping his clipboard. But when pressed for specifics, his answers were evasive, and he seemed flustered by my directness. The situation became increasingly uncomfortable. Despite my calm demeanor, I could tell he was becoming agitated by my refusal to accept his authority without question. His tone grew sharper, and he began listing supposed violations on my property, from the size of my barn to the type of fencing I used. The nerve of this man, standing on my land, dictating terms as though he owned it. Yet I held my ground. "This is a private ranch," I said firmly. "You have no authority here, and I won't be signing anything today." His face hardened. It was clear that Mr. Campbell wasn't used to being challenged. Without another word, he turned and left, leaving behind a promise to return, and a simmering tension that would soon escalate. Days later, Mr. Campbell returned, this time with reinforcements. 2 HOA board members who seemed equally out of their depth on a ranch. Together, they presented a formal request for compliance with HOA standards, including a list of changes that were laughably impractical. One of the demands was to repaint my barn to conform to their approved color palette. The absurdity of the request made me laugh out loud. This barn had stood in its natural, weathered beauty for decades, long before the HOA even existed. To demand that I repaint it felt like an insult to the history of the land. Another demand involved removing a windmill that had been a functional part of the ranch for generations. Mr. Campbell claimed it didn't meet aesthetic guidelines, but I knew it was just another attempt to exert control. These demands were not only irrational, but also impractical, proving their lack of understanding about rural life. As I read through the list, my irritation grew. The HOA seemed to think they could impose their suburban standards on a working ranch, disregarding the very essence of why people chose to live away from HOA-governed communities in the first place. When I voiced my objections, the conversation turned heated. Mr. Campbell argued that my compliance would benefit the community, a laughable notion considering my ranch was isolated and self-sustaining. His persistence bordered on harassment. I began to suspect that this wasn't about standards or aesthetics. It was about control. The HOA leader seemed determined to prove his authority, even if it meant overstepping legal and moral boundaries. Standing my ground, I refused to sign any documents or make changes. "This is my land," I repeated. "You don't get to dictate how I manage it." My refusal only seemed to fuel their determination, and they left with the promise of escalating the matter further. Their demands made no sense, but their intentions were clear. They wanted power, and I wasn't about to give it to them. The third visit from Mr. Campbell and his entourage marked a turning point. This time, they didn't come empty-handed. They brought with them a legal notice, a document filled with convoluted language designed to intimidate. It was their formal attempt to enforce compliance, citing their supposed jurisdiction over my property. I stood at the entrance of my ranch as they approached, holding the document as though it were a weapon. "We're giving you one last chance to cooperate," Mr. Campbell warned, his voice dripping with condescension. The audacity of his tone only strengthened my resolve. "I've reviewed your claims," I said, my voice steady, "and I've consulted with legal experts. Your HOA has no legal grounds here." My statement seemed to catch them off guard. For the first time, doubt flickered across Mr. Campbell's face. The confrontation escalated as they argued their case, but I refused to back down. I explained, in no uncertain terms, that my ranch was not subject to their authority. When I presented them with evidence, property records, and legal exemptions, it became clear that they hadn't done their homework. As the conversation grew more heated, it became a battle of wills. Mr. Campbell's frustration was evident, but so was his unwillingness to admit defeat. His anger boiled over as I maintained my calm demeanor, pointing out every flaw in his argument. The other HOA members stood behind him, visibly uncomfortable with the tension. It was clear that they were questioning the wisdom of pursuing this battle. But Mr. Campbell wasn't ready to concede. "We'll see about that," he spat, storming off with a promise to escalate matters further. I watched them leave, a mixture of anger and determination coursing through me. This wasn't just about my ranch anymore. It was about standing up to bullies who thought they could impose their will without consequence. As the conflict with Mr. Campbell intensified, I decided to dig deeper into his past. Something about his relentless determination felt personal, not just procedural. What I discovered only added fuel to the fire. Through conversations with neighbors and a bit of research, I learned that Mr. Campbell had a history of overstepping his bounds. His tenure as HOA leader was marked by controversies, ranging from frivolous fines to outright harassment of residents. He thrived on control and seemed to target anyone who challenged his authority. One story stood out in particular. A retired couple had been forced to sell their home after Mr. Campbell imposed relentless fines for minor violations. It was a chilling reminder of what could happen if people didn't stand up to him. As I pieced together his history, a pattern emerged. Mr. Campbell wasn't just enforcing rules. He was using the HOA as a tool to satisfy his own ego and thirst for power. His tactics were ruthless, but his motives were transparent to anyone willing to look. Armed with this knowledge, I felt more confident than ever in my fight. This wasn't just about protecting my land. It was about exposing a bully who had gotten away with too much for too long. When legal threats didn't work, Mr. Campbell resorted to more direct intimidation tactics. One evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, I noticed a car idling near the edge of my property. Its headlights cut through the darkness, a silent reminder that I was being watched. The next day, a letter was left in my mailbox. It wasn't an official HOA notice, but a handwritten message warning me of consequences if I didn't comply. The tone was menacing, and while it wasn't signed, I had no doubt who was behind it. This escalation was both infuriating and alarming. It was clear that Mr. Campbell was willing to cross ethical lines to achieve his goals. But instead of intimidating me, his actions only strengthened my resolve. I documented every incident, from the suspicious car to the threatening letter. I also installed security cameras around my property, ensuring that any further attempts at harassment would be recorded. If he thought he could scare me into submission, he was sorely mistaken. When I confronted Mr. Campbell about the letter, he feigned ignorance, his smirk betraying his true feelings. "You're imagining things," he said dismissively, but his words lacked conviction. It was obvious that he was beginning to feel the pressure. Despite his attempts to intimidate me, I remained firm. My ranch was my sanctuary, and I would defend it with everything I had. After enduring weeks of harassment and escalating threats, I decided it was time to take the fight directly to Mr. Campbell and the HOA. Instead of playing defense, I went on the offensive, leveraging every resource at my disposal to expose their overreach. First, I filed a formal complaint with local authorities, detailing the HOA's attempts to assert unlawful control over my property. I included evidence of their false claims, the threatening letter, and footage from my security cameras. The authorities were alarmed by the extent of their actions and assured me they would investigate. Next, I turned to the community. Through local forums and social media, I shared my story, revealing the lengths to which Mr. Campbell was willing to go to enforce his fabricated authority. The response was overwhelming. Neighbors who had also suffered under his leadership came forward with their own stories, creating a chorus of voices against the HOA's bullying tactics. When word reached Mr. Campbell, his reaction was swift and furious. He called an emergency HOA meeting, likely to rally support and regain control of the narrative. But the damage was already done. The community was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to his abuses of power. By standing up to him, I had ignited a movement. It was clear that this wasn't just about my ranch. It was about justice for everyone who had been wronged by the HOA. As my story gained traction, something unexpected happened. I began receiving messages of support from people I'd never met. Some were neighbors from nearby properties, while others were complete strangers who had heard about my fight through local news outlets and social media. One day, a group of local farmers showed up at my ranch, offering their help. They brought tools, supplies, and plenty of moral support. "We've dealt with people like him before," one of them said. "We're not going to let him bully you." Even members of the HOA started to turn against Mr. Campbell. At the next meeting, several board members publicly criticized his actions, accusing him of overstepping his authority and jeopardizing the HOA's reputation. The cracks in his facade were beginning to show. The community's support was a turning point. It reminded me that I wasn't alone in this fight, and that, together, we were stronger than any one person's thirst for control. Desperation pushed Mr. Campbell to take drastic measures. One morning, I awoke to find a notice posted on my gate, claiming that my ranch was in violation of newly amended HOA bylaws. It was a blatant attempt to rewrite the rules to fit his agenda, but it was also a legal misstep. The notice claimed that if I didn't comply, the HOA would pursue a lien on my property. This crossed the line from harassment to outright fraud, and I knew it was time to escalate matters. I contacted my attorney, who confirmed that the HOA had no legal authority to enforce such actions against my property. Armed with this information, I filed a lawsuit against Mr. Campbell and the HOA, citing harassment, fraud, and defamation. The legal battle that followed was intense. Mr. Campbell tried to spin the narrative, portraying me as uncooperative and defiant. But the evidence was stacked against him, and his attempts to justify his actions only made him look more desperate. The case quickly gained media attention, shining a spotlight on the HOA's unethical practices. Under public scrutiny, their position crumbled, and Mr. Campbell faced mounting pressure to resign. The final confrontation between Mr. Campbell and me was nothing short of explosive. During a court hearing, faced with undeniable evidence of his wrongdoing, he lost his composure completely. As the judge questioned him about the HOA's actions, his answers became increasingly erratic. He deflected blame onto his fellow board members, accused me of orchestrating a smear campaign, and even suggested that the community's backlash was a personal vendetta. But the courtroom wasn't the place for his theatrics. The judge saw through his attempts to shift responsibility and reprimanded him for his behavior. His outburst was the final straw for many in the HOA, who had grown tired of his antics and lack of accountability. In that moment, the man who had tried so hard to exert control over others found himself powerless, exposed, and alone. After months of conflict, the lawsuit concluded in my favor. The court ruled that the HOA had no authority over my property and ordered them to cease all attempts at enforcement. Mr. Campbell was held personally accountable for his actions, facing significant fines and being forced to step down from his position. The victory was more than just legal. It was a reaffirmation of my rights as a landowner and a reminder that standing up to bullies is always worth it. As I walked across my ranch, the weight of the ordeal lifted, replaced by a sense of pride and gratitude. The land was mine again, untouched by HOA interference and protected by the strength of a community that had come together to support me. In the end, Mr. Campbell's downfall was a testament to the power of resilience and the importance of fighting for what's right. My ranch stood as a symbol of that victory, a place of freedom, independence, and unyielding determination.